I really love the show Disenchantment, and this is actually a compilation of my favorite videos I ever made from covering the show while it was airing over the past however many years. I didn't include every video I ever made, but I did include some of my favorites, including ones in which I made correct predictions and speculations about mysteries in the show. However, since these were all being made while the show was airing, some parts are filled with speculation and questions that were obviously answered later in the show, just in case that throws you off a bit. The first part is going to be older speculation, the second part will be coverage of the show's connection to Futurama, and the last part will be my reviews and breakdowns of seasons 4 and 5 of Disenchantment. Okay, enjoy. So, Disenchantment Part 3 dropped last week, and we got to see a couple more examples of this really cool ancient alphabet/language that we got a hint of back in Part 2. The writers and creators of Disenchantment are no strangers to these kinds of alphabet ciphers either. Back in Futurama, they created not one, but 2 different alien languages that were translated by fans and used to decode background gags and Easter eggs. In fact, fans had basically figured out Futurama's first alien script within a single airing of Futurama's pilot episode, Space Pilot 3000. Basically, they noticed that there was a Slurm billboard in this scene that said "Drink Slurm," and later that same design is seen on a Slurm poster, but with alienese in place of the word drink. This was the first mini Rosetta Stone for the fans, who then managed to translate this piece of graffiti in the same episode by filling in the blanks. Honestly, I'm really impressed by this because there were only 2 shared letters between the Drink Slurm sign and this graffiti, but somehow they managed to determine that it spells Venusians go home, a committed fan base from day one. The second Futurama alien script was much more complicated, and while they provided some visual help, like these monoliths, it took months for fans to crack the code. Honestly, I still don't fully understand how that one works. With Disenchantment's ancient script, they've been a lot more withholding of examples within the show. The first piece was showcased back in Part 2, and fans pretty quickly deciphered it, determining that it spelled out quod est occultatum. I'm probably pronouncing that horrendously wrong because it's Latin. Anyways, it translates to "it is hidden." Honestly, there must have been some actual cipher busters at work on this because I have no idea how they managed to decode this. Again, impressive and committed fan bases. So when they showed this massive piece of ancient script in the 10th episode of Disenchantment Part 3, I immediately jumped to try and translate it, as did many other fans of the series. Here's how I did it. First, I took the previously translated letters, which were A, C, D, E, L, M, O, Q, S, T, and U, and inserted them where they fit, which gave us this. A decent chunk was legible thanks to the previous translations. Next, I looked for obvious words with missing letters, and the first to stand out was that this is clearly Dreamland, which gives us additional translations for the letters R and N. So after filling in those letters, we got this. So this really helped fill it out. Next, there were a couple more clear words thanks to these additions. I could tell that this said future, so this gave us the F translation. And because both of these letters were the same in this word, it was safe to assume it was a vowel, which helps determine that this probably says citizens. So now we have F, I, and Z to translate through. Z doesn't help much, but F and I are huge. So here's what it looks like after adding those. So we're getting pretty close here, and there's a lot more we can determine. This word seems to say fought, and because something was fought, we can assume this word was battle, which gives us B, G, and H, all very helpful letters. Add those to the translation, and we get this. And from here, the rest is honestly pretty simple. It's hard to mess it up in context. The full translation says, "A battle was fought between these kings and the rightful citizens of Dreamland who lost and cast a curse on all future rulers." This lines up with some of the information we were spoon-fed throughout Part 3 of Disenchantment, and also with what Oddval said about the translation.
Those crazy runes tell of a battle fought in Dreamland long ago between Tiabini's ancestors and their foes.
We learned that there seemed to be a curse placed on the monarchical line of Oggs, and the fact that this script specifically underlines the word rightful citizens is telling. It's clearly hinted in episode 10 that the elves are actually the original settlers of Dreamland, based on the discovery of this ancient throne.
The legendary ancient seat of elven power.
And on top of this, there was one more piece of ancient script in episode 8, Hey Pig Spender, and this one is very intriguing. When you translate this, it says Freckles was here. Freckles was of course the dummy that Zog spoke through at the end of the season during the height of his madness.
Oh, I see this castle already has a dummy. Am I right, dummy?
But this seems to imply that Freckles might actually be sentient. Combine that with the fact that it was clearly Dagmar who sold him the dummy in the first place, and you got something very interesting happening here. If Freckles actually is sentient, this also means that he knows how to write in this ancient language, which clearly isn't a common script in Dreamland. It appears to tie to Maru and possibly Hell, which would further connect Dagmar and Freckles. We actually got our first look at Freckles back in the first episode of Disenchantment seen here in the window of the dummy store. So with all of the script we've been able to translate, this is what the full alphabet looks like thus far. The only letters we're still missing are J, P, V, X, and Y. And I'm sure those letters will easily be translated after part 4. I can only imagine they'll start using the script more for background gags now that the translations are out there. So, Disenchantment Part 3 definitely laid more groundwork for ongoing mysteries than any season before it, and honestly, I'm here for it. There appears to be a ton of question marks surrounding Dreamland, including in regards to its rightful citizens and possibly its ruler. So, with big mysteries comes rampant speculation, and I'm here to tell you why I think the show could be hinting that Miri the Mop Girl is Dreamland's true ruler. But intertwined with this whole idea are a ton of other great mysteries, theories, and speculation, and there's a lot to cover, so let's get started. Before we get to Miri the Mop Girl, let's talk about elves, trogs, and Dreamland. There was tons of new information revealed this season, but very few solid answers to those mysteries. But if we take a look at all of this information side by side, I think we can actually determine some likely answers, or at the very least, have some fun speculating. One of the biggest revelations at the end of Part 3 was this reveal.
Legendary ancient seat of elven power.
And the revelation that this legendary elven throne exists underneath Dreamland Castle. Now, we weren't told much more about it, but its mere existence implies that the elves actually have a history in Dreamland. An important history, given that this is a legendary ancient throne. But they also revealed some more evidence that could connect back to the elves. If you caught my video about decoding Disenchantment's ancient language, we translated this ancient script, which reads, "A battle was fought between these kings and the rightful citizens of Dreamland who lost and cast a curse on all future rulers." So if we take into account this ancient hidden elven throne, and the fact that the current citizens of Dreamland seemingly aren't its rightful citizens according to this script, then we can definitely speculate that the rightful citizens of Dreamland may in fact be the elves. And that's not the only evidence for this. The ancient throne of elven power bears this swirly symbol on it, and similar symbols can actually be seen throughout Dreamland and Dreamland Castle, almost as though the current society appropriated these ancient elven symbols as their own. But perhaps the most important piece of evidence that was right under our nose the entire time is the crown worn by the elven ruler, Rulo. Does this design look familiar? Well, it should. Take a look at it right next to Dreamland Castle. It was all right there from the beginning. This absolutely cannot be a coincidence. These designs are way too unique for that. I think when you take all of these things into account, it's impossible not to come to the conclusion that Dreamland was in fact an elven society. These elves fought with kings of Dreamland and lost, but then cast a curse on the future rulers of Dreamland. But here's where it gets even more interesting. That ancient script that we translated was actually scribbled on a torn page from a book called The Secret History of the Kings of Dreamland, which runs down all of the kings of Dreamland from Agog to Zog. This reveals that all of Dreamland's kings' names end with Og, but most interestingly, the pages are torn out beginning with what appears to be the name Trog. This also labels Trog as cursed from the little that we can read on the page. So I think we can further deduce that Trog may have been the king that defeated the elves, aka the rightful citizens of Dreamland, and was therefore the first to be cursed by them. But let's take this even further, because the name Trog has even bigger implications. We've also been introduced to a race of elf-like creatures that live underneath Dreamland called, you guessed it, Trogs. This cannot be just a coincidence. So here's my theory. After King Trog defeated the elves, they split. Half of the elves retreated to Elfwood to live in secrecy and hiding, a place we've seen extensively in parts 1 and 2, while the other half of the elves retreated underground and hiding underneath Dreamland. The elves that retreated underneath Dreamland evolved into what we now know as Trogs. It's possible that they named themselves after the ruler who defeated them, or that their obsession with this ruler ended up becoming their entire identity as a culture, but this information has now been lost to time. Trogs and elves obviously share a ton of similarities, but you can likely account for their pale skin tone as evolutionary after years of living underground away from sunlight. There are other interesting implications here too. It could mean that Trog blood has the same magical properties as elf blood, which also means it could have magical effects when used in the vial on the Eternity Pendant, which could come into play now that we've seen that this Eternity Pendant is actually amongst this junk that the Trogs stole from Dreamland Castle. Everything above, I am honestly pretty confident canon. I feel like these theories really line up with the evidence thus far, but now is where we maybe get a little bit more speculative, but not without evidence. So let's talk about Miri the Mop Girl. Miri the Mop Girl has been a big mystery for the entirety of Disenchantment. A lot of people expected her to be of great importance in part 1 because of her prominent background presence. Then in part 2, we're properly introduced to her through her second job as a server slinging coffee.
You look really familiar, Miri.
I have another job working for people who never notice me because they're so self-absorbed.
Now, admittedly, the main thing that set me down this hypothetical path was some of the imagery in part 3. These could of course be entirely coincidental, but I thought it would be fun to travel this path and see where it takes us. In episode 10 of part 3, it's revealed that Dreamland's crown doesn't fit on Bean's head, and she tosses it away. This honestly felt reminiscent of a bride at a wedding tossing a bouquet, and the person who caught it was none other than Miri the Mop Girl. But that wasn't the first image that made me think there might be something here. There's a blink and you'll miss it moment early in part 3, where a shot pans down through the various levels of Dreamland Castle. But if you pause, you can see Miri sitting ominously on the throne of Dreamland. This felt way too intentional, and the complete lack of attention drawn to it leads me to believe that there's something more to this shot. This show is absolutely rife with foreshadowing, so I have a theory here. If we're to go down this hypothetical path that Miri may actually be Dreamland's rightful ruler, we'd have to ask how from a practical perspective and why from a story perspective. We learned a lot about the line of Oggs in this part, including the fact that Una was formerly in love with Zog's brother, King Yogg, who was poisoned. We get a brief glimpse of King Yogg in this portrait, and we see that he, as well as some of the previous Oggs, have much browner hair than Zog. Zog also at one point apologizes that he never went out with a human.
Sorry, I never went out with a human.
Which, that's a lot to unpack, including what it means for Bean and Dagmar, but I think this is an important pattern we've seen. Zog has 3 known lovers in the series: Dagmar, Una, and Ursula. The only known lover that we know of for Yogg is Una. So with the evidence presented, we can maybe deduce that the line of Oggs, historically, have a thing for non-human partners. Here's another fun little detail. Did y'all notice this cute little bear in part 3? Their hair sure is suspiciously shaped like King Zog's, isn't it? I think we can possibly assume that this is the child of Zog and Ursula after their affair. But if we take into account this attraction to non-humans, and the fact that Zog seems to have a habit of having children with all of these different fantasy species, and we apply that down the line of Oggs, it would not be ridiculous to assume that at some point, one of the Oggs mated with an elf. Given that they likely were Dreamland's rightful citizens, Dreamland must have been full of elves in the past. So here's where the rampant speculation kicks in. I think that it's possible that Miri is distantly related to one of the Ogg kings and an elf. Besides the throne room imagery, there are a few details / mysteries about Miri that lead me to believe this is possible. For one, Miri is short. We learn that she's 23 years old, and she claims that her growth was stunted due to drinking coffee, but I think this might be a purposeful misdirect. Obviously, if an elf mated with a human, their offspring would be small. We've even gotten evidence that Elfo is only half elf and possibly half ogre, and he is incredibly small. But if Miri is distantly related to an elf, it would make sense that each of her ancestors in that line would get a little taller until Miri, who is still short but not elf-sized. Secondly, we have never seen Miri's ears. Even when we saw more of her face when she's working as a waitress, her ears are covered entirely by her hair. I would not be surprised if a later reveal of her ears shows that they are pointy like elf ears. Speaking of her hair, and this part is flimsy at best, but still worth pointing out, Miri's hair seems to be the same brown as the historical King Oggs we've seen. And then there's of course the fact that we basically got confirmation that Miri is magical in some way.
Haven't you ever seen an enchanted broom before?
What are you, some kind of wizard?
Well, now that you mention it.
This could be explained by her being distantly related to elves, a magical race. Now, obviously this is definitely speculative based on imagery and history, and we don't have concrete evidence for this. But let's talk about why this makes sense within the story. It seems like Disenchantment may be setting up some of these characters who exist between multiple countries and societies that are at odds with one another as a means to eventually unite the world as we know it. It seems like Bean has a connection between Dreamland and Maru, Elfo seemingly has a connection between the elves and the ogres, and now possibly Dreamland as well if you take into account the Elven history theories, and the show seems to be a little bit obsessed with uniting these different countries. If you're to assume that by the end of the show there will be a new rightful ruler of Dreamland, it would make the most sense if this person person was actually related to both the line of Oggs as well as the elves. Though the script about the curse does refer to the rightful citizens of Dreamland, it doesn't imply that the kings are not the rightful rulers. From a story standpoint, I think it more than makes sense that Miri, a descendant of elves and Oggs, would be the best person to rule and unite Dreamland, potentially lifting the curse. So there it is, my theory on Dreamland's rightful ruler. Who knows if I'm on the money here, but honestly, after writing it out, I feel pretty confident that I'm on the right track. Honestly, I have never had this much fun speculating about a TV series, and it's what I absolutely love most about Disenchantment. We know for sure that we'll be getting at least 10 more episodes of Disenchantment, but though it isn't confirmed, a little digging around on the WGA website seems to imply that the show has been renewed for a third production cycle, which could mean that the show is slated to run at least 60 episodes total. This isn't confirmation, but it is a strong indication that this might be the case. I'm really eager to see how they decide to start tying up all these mysteries, but what do you think? Am I onto something with Miri the Mop Girl? Do you have any theories about the elves, trogs, and Dreamland? Let me know below in the comments. Make sure to do all the liking and subscribing stuff, and stay tuned. Peace. Okay, so the discourse about Futurama and Disenchantment sharing a universe first started with Disenchantment Part 1 back in 2018. There is a blink and you'll miss it cameo from Bender, Fry, and the Professor in the forwards traveling time machine from the late Philip J. Fry. Here it is. Did you see it? Here, I'll pause it for you this time. So, when this first aired, there was tons of speculation, including from myself, about where in the Futurama timeline the events of Disenchantment could fit. And through studying the time travel periods in the late Philip J. Fry, there were a few places that people landed on outside of the most obvious, the medieval past. The time period that I personally thought made the most sense was one of these medieval ages that we see crop up and get destroyed while Fry is frozen, meaning it could have taken place somewhere between the year 2000 and the year 3000. The year on Farnsworth's time machine places it around 2500 to be more precise. However, among many, the main contenders were the year 252,525, which appears to be another medieval age, though the only real distinction is that knights ride ostriches. Then there's the year 1.5 million, another medieval age where man has been enslaved by giraffe. Pretty much right off the bat, not really a great match for Dreamland or Disenchantment. But now with our new evidence from Futurama's latest episode, I Know What You Did Next Xmas, we've got an entirely new location for its placement on the timeline. In this one, Farnsworth is now traveling back from the end of time. He passes most of the time periods we saw in the late Philip J. Fry all the way through the year 10,000, and then we see the Disenchantment time period. So, allegedly this will take place sometime between 3023 and 10,000. I've seen some people want to try and pinpoint the exact year on the time machine in this shot, but if you look closely during this sequence, these years and this part don't correlate to anything, it's just rotating nonsense. So this still firmly places it after the main events of Futurama, but now it is before the events of the far future seen in the late Philip J. Fry. There are actually pieces of evidence within Disenchantment that point to this placement being possible. In Disenchantment Chapter 14's The Lonely Heart is a Hunter, while walking through the caverns of the castle, piled amongst the copious amounts of treasures, we can actually see a holophoner. This is definitely potential evidence of technology left over from the Futurama age. Similarly, in Chapter 21's Subterranean Homesick Blues, amongst the piles of treasure hoarded by the Trogs underground, you can see a near identical doomsday device to the one Farnsworth invented and used in the episode Time Keeps on Slippin'. Though they obviously did actually use this to implode a star system, so it can't be the exact device, but the fact that one so similar exists is a piece of evidence. There are also some other smaller pieces of evidence later, a couple in Steamland in particular. When Bean first gets to Steamland, we see a model ship that looks an awful lot like the Planet Express ship. It's possible this was designed after the historic ship. The airship company in Steamland is called Gunderson's Airships, a brand name of nuts from the Futurama era. We even see presumably a delivery company called Airship Express, or at least a logo for one. Was it possible that these aspects of Futurama's history were passed down and inspired these aspects of Steamland? And one of the coolest pieces of evidence is that in Disenchantment's 36th chapter, Bean is swimming down to an underwater castle below Dreamland, passing a ship. Inside that ship, a creature that appears to be decapodian, a la Zoidberg. Now, the color seems to be different, though it could just be because of the colors being muted in the depths of water here, but the design is clearly decapodian. It's possible that some decapodians survived underwater after the Futurama era, or perhaps that this is an evolution of the species all these years later. However, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but this latest episode of Futurama actually sort of creates more issues with the idea that these universes are shared than it does confirm a shared universe, for a couple of reasons. For one, when the professor is traveling backwards in time, before he reaches the Disenchantment cameo, we actually see the Planet Express building with a giant bender destroying part of it and walking into the city. Then he sees the interior of Dreamland Castle, and then he arrives back in the current Futurama time period, back in Planet Express. I don't think I have to explain why this makes no sense. The time machine travels through time, not space. Why would Planet Express cease to exist during the Dreamland/Disenchantment era and then show back up again afterwards? On top of that, we actually see the remaining foundation of the Planet Express building in the year 10,000 in the late Philip J. Fry. On top of this, the geography doesn't make much sense either if Planet Express and Dreamland Castle are supposed to be in the same locations. In New York, the Planet Express building borders a river and is at sea level. The room scene in Dreamland Castle is high in a giant castle, which is in turn high on a massive cliff face far above the water. Plus, there's the issue with the Disenchantment world map not really matching the actual Earth map, though that could obviously just be chalked up to the Disenchantment era cartographers, I guess. Maybe they didn't get it all right.
I'd say don't quit your day job, but you're awful at that too.
So, though it is obviously very fun to speculate about exactly how these two Groeningverse shows share a universe, it's not exactly cut and dry. Though I do have a little theory. I had always said that it didn't really make sense to me for Futurama and Disenchantment to do any sort of crossover. This was, however, before Futurama returned, so I was saying this under the impression that the only way for this to happen would have been in an episode of Disenchantment. Disenchantment is a story-driven series that is pretty firmly set in its own world and lore. It wouldn't have made sense for the show to have wasted a precious episode taking a detour to explain some kind of Futurama crossover. However, with Disenchantment now ending and Futurama having returned, it makes a ton more sense to me that a crossover could happen in Futurama, a series that is far more episodic and takes plenty of wild, detoury adventures. On top of that, back when Futurama ended last time in 2013, the following year we saw Simpsorama, a Futurama crossover on The Simpsons, giving them, at the time, one last hurrah via another Groening series. Could we see that happen again with Disenchantment, but on Futurama this time? Now, I've also hypothesized that this shot of a giant bender in Planet Express might be teasing a future episode. We've seen Giant Bender in the non-canon Anthology of Interest 1, and a shinier, silvery Giant Bender in Benderama, but that doesn't fit the timeline at all. However, in Times Square, there has been this amazing multi-story advertisement for the new season of Futurama that shows Bender get hit by Farnsworth's growth ray, and then blow up to giant size. This has not been in any episode of the season, and doesn't appear to be a part of these 10 episodes. I've been wondering if it's just an advertisement, or if it's actually hinting at a Futurama story that we might see next year. This wouldn't be the first time Futurama subtly teased a future episode. And if this is the case, is it possible that this little Disenchantment cameo is actually meant to tease that we'll be getting a Disenchantment crossover episode sometime before the Giant Bender episode next season? I mean, look, this is all pretty much pie in the sky speculation. Making a Futurama Disenchantment crossover would have a lot more hurdles than a Simpsons Futurama crossover, two shows that are produced by 20th Century Television. With Disenchantment being on Netflix, it's not nearly as easy, as there would need to be inter-network cooperation and negotiating. But I would kinda love to see it happen, and if anyone can do it, it's Matt Groening. There are some really fun potential character pairings. Imagine Lucy convincing Zoidberg to do bad things, Bender and Bean pounding beers, Fry and Elfo being generally childish. There's a lot of fun to be had. Ultimately, I don't think it will ever really happen, and though it's a ton of fun to speculate about how these universes might fit together, if they do, I still think that these are all ultimately just Easter eggs and references. Little nods to the shows that have a ton of crossover producers, writers, and animators. And that's why we make these videos. It's fun to overly speculate about the tiny minutiae and these little details. When Disenchantment first aired, I actually wrote a similar video speculating about how the universes could tie together in a series called Animation Investigation that I used to write for Nerdist. You know what happened? The website The AV Club decided to write a hit piece about it.
Damn it, nerds, stop trying to jam Disenchantment and Futurama into a single shared universe,
wrote William Hughes.
This is why we can't have nice things and or fun TV Easter eggs anymore, people, because it's apparently inevitable inevitable that every single fun little joke in the entire history of pop culture is eventually going to get turned into a 10-minute explainer video, all because people can't stop themselves from taking these things too damn seriously.
What time is it? Time for you to shut up!
Look, bro, I don't know how to break this to you, but this is actually you taking these things too damn seriously. You really can't let fans have a little fun and speculate about two comedy cartoons? We know it's not important, but we're the ones having fun here. You're the one with your head in your ass. And yeah, I'm still salty about this asinine article that was written 5 years ago, so what? Alright, I think that's all I've got. Thanks for humoring me. Peace. Disenchantment has officially wrapped up, delivering us 50 episodes over 5 years, and the show had a huge number of crossover writers and staff members with Futurama. So, over its run, we got tons of references and allusions to Futurama itself. About 35 of them, in fact. So, now that the show is complete, please enjoy this comprehensive list of all 35 Futurama references found in Disenchantment. The very first reference we see to Futurama is super early on in Chapter 2, For Whom the Pig Oinks. We see Merkimer at the Royal Wigsmith, and here on the shelf is unmistakably Philip J. Fry's hair. A fun and small reference, you love to see it. Chapter 7's Love's Tender Rampage contains what I think is more of a wink and nudge allusion to Futurama when Lucy describes Elfo's fake girlfriend.
So, super hot one-eyed girl with a dead family. Sounds legit.
A description that coincidentally also describes Leela. The next reference comes in Chapter 10 when Lucy rewinds and replays events with this magical orb. If you freeze frame, you can catch an image of Fry, Bender, and Farnsworth in the forward traveling time machine from Futurama's 6th season episode, The Late Philip J. Fry, an all-time classic Futurama episode that earned them an Emmy. In a fun twist, the latest season of Futurama actually used this very time machine to hide a Disenchantment Easter egg, sparking the endless debate about whether or not these shows share a universe. That's it for part 1, and in part 2 of Disenchantment, they really dial up the Futurama references. In Chapter 12, Stairway to Hell, we see this series of tubes used to transport Elfo from heaven to hell, which look remarkably like the tubes seen to launch people across New York in Futurama. Also in Chapter 12, King Zog, voiced by John DiMaggio, unleashes his fury with this nod to DiMaggio's famous Futurama role, Bender Bending Rodriguez.
Fight my shiny metal axe!
Pretty on the nose, but fun for sure. Actually, funny enough, in the Futurama episode The Inhuman Torch, Bender also says, "Bite my shiny metal axe."
Fight my shiny metal axe!
Also in Stairway to Hell, we have a couple more allusions, smaller connections that aren't as overt. I mostly think that these are just coincidences, but it's still fun to point them out. We see Jerry trying to smash bugs with a hammer.
Aim where they're going to be, Jerry, not where they are.
This is the same verbiage used in Futurama's Anthology of Interest 2 segment, Raiders of the Lost Arcade, where Fry wants to know what life would be like if it were more like a video game.
Instead of shooting where I was, you should have shot at where I was going to be.
Stairway to Hell is written by David X. Cohen, who is not only Futurama's showrunner, but wrote the Raiders of the Lost Arcade segment as well, so these certainly could be direct references to his own series. And along with this last one, the fact that Lucy flies Bean and Elfo out of hell, it's a lot like Bender flying Fry and Leela out of robot hell in the first season of Futurama. Fun stuff. The next one comes in Chapter 14, The Lonely Heart is a Hunter. We see Bean and Zog in the basement storage area of Dreamland's castle, and here in the background we see what looks an awful lot like a holophoner from Futurama's episode Parasites Lost, and of course its original series finale, The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings. Both incredible episodes. This feels like it was probably a fun little reference thrown in by one of the animators. In Chapter 18, we hear Zog throw out another line that Futurama's Bender is famous for.
Well, let's go already!
And it definitely works great for both characters.
Let's go already!
The next couple come in my favorite episode of Disenchantment Part 2, Chapter 19, The Electric Princess. First is a hilarious deep cut. We see Bean open up a drawer on Sky Gunderson's airship to reveal assorted lengths of wire. Back in the very first episode of Futurama, Space Pilot 3000, Professor Farnsworth brags about the drawer where he keeps his assorted lengths of wire, and if you look closely, they are all organized the exact same way. This episode also features a little model of the Planet Express ship in Gunderson's shed, as seen here. This again just feels coincidental, but it's definitely worth pointing out that Bean's introduction to Steamland through this big window does feel a bit like Fry's introduction to New York back in Space Pilot 3000. We also first see the brand name Gunderson here, later revealed to be Alva's last name. Gunderson was also a brand name used in Futurama for Gunderson's Nuts, but The Simpsons also has a character named Gil Gunderson. It seems like it's just a name that these writers really like using. The Gunderson airship's business in Steamland is actually located on Farnsworth Boulevard as well, a reference to Futurama's Professor Hubert J. Farnsworth, Farnsworth, whose name is in turn a reference to the inventor Philo Farnsworth, a pioneer of television engineering. And the last reference in part 2 that I noticed is this funny courtroom gag.
Chairs with 5 Z's.
I think I've done enough court reporting to know how to spell Chaz.
This, of course, parallels Futurama's famous Star Trek episode where no fan has gone before, when George Takei is giving his autograph to Melvar.
Melvar has 3 L's.
I think I've done enough conventions to know how to spell Melvar.
Now on to part 3. The first episode, Subterranean Homesick Blues, gives us a couple more nods. We pretty quickly get a really fun little Easter egg in the Trog Society's room of hoarded treasure. You can see what looks to be the Doomsday device that Professor Farnsworth built and used in the Futurama episode Time Keeps on Slippin'.
Doomsday device? Ah, now the ball's in Farnsworth's court.
One of Futurama's best episodes, to be honest. Later in the episode, King Zog once again delivers one of Bender's famous catchphrases.
Let's go already!
Hard not to connect these dots with DiMaggio playing both characters. Next, there are a few more found in Steamland. This feels more like an illusion, but when the Archdruidess knocks over this guy in Steamland, she slaps him 3 times across the face.
Those were my legs, lady. You could have used a hand signal.
Hand signal, eh?
Oh!
She's also voiced by Tress MacNeille, who plays Mom in Futurama, a character known for her triple slaps.
Jam a bastard in it, you crap! Ow!
In the League of Gallivanting Scrutinators, we see a picture on the wall of an explorer and a narwhal. Okay, so maybe this is just a cool adventure-y thing for an adventurer to do, but it does look like Lilu from the Futurama movie Bender's Big Score, which was an integral part of Lars Fillmore's story. Also seen in the League's headquarters is the head and neck of a giraffe sporting a crown, which could be a nod to the royal giraffe we see in the episode The Late Philip J. Fry, who's enslaved mankind in the year 1.5 million. I also noticed the logo for what seems to be a delivery company called Airship Express, and yeah, that logo is very familiar, almost as though it's literally Planet Express, but in Steamland. Here's one that I see a lot of people talk about that might require a little explanation. In the episodes Steamland Confidential and Freak Out, as well as many later Steamland-focused episodes, we see this carnival on the pier, and there's a ride called Trip to the Moon with a giant moon-faced character on it. You can see the roller coaster goes through his eye. Lots of folks credit this as a reference to Craterface, as originally seen in the second episode of Futurama The Series Has Landed, later seen in Meanwhile, and even in this newest season's related to items you've viewed. He's the mascot at Luna Park, which is of course the theme park on the moon.
I'll have to confiscate your alcohol, sir.
Better mascots than you have tried.
And in his first appearance, Bender sticks a beer bottle in his eye as well, just like how the roller coaster goes through the eye here. So these are actually both references to a classic piece of film history, a French short film called A Trip to the Moon. The iconic image from this film is the moon sporting this face and this rocket getting stuck in his eye. So while they are definitely both references, it's not a Futurama reference strictly, they're both referencing the same thing. And the last reference I noticed in part 3 is probably the best one. In the spooky ventriloquist dummy shop, you can see a dummy that looks suspiciously like Bender. Honestly, I kinda want this dummy almost as much as I want a Tickle Me Bender, though this plushie I got comes pretty close. There's also a gargoyle that many have pointed out looks like Pazuzu, but I think it might just be a gargoyle. Either way, we'll at least point it out.
Pazuzu, you ungrateful gargoyle!
Now for part 4. I love this first one. In episode 4, Goon Baby Goon, Sorcerio takes these hands back from Elfo and says,
"Well, as far as I'm concerned, they're the devil's hands, not idle playthings."
This is very specifically a reference to Futurama's very first series finale, The Devil's Hands Are Idle Playthings, in which Fry switches hands with the robot devil. That title is in turn a reference to the phrase idle hands are the devil's playthings. And in this same exact scene, we can actually see the recently deceased Pendergast's head in a jar, remarkably similar looking to the classic heads in jars in Futurama. We also see these again in part 5. A few episodes later, we got one of the most fun references we've ever gotten. As Bean swims down to the broken off part of Dreamland Castle, she passes this ship, and inside there is very clearly a Zoidberg-esque crustacean creature. He has a couple extra fins, but this is unmistakably a decapodian face. And the last reference in part 4 comes in the penultimate episode, The Goodbye Girl. Lucy discovers a massive comic library under the castle, and in this shot, which is filled with tons of fun Easter eggs and references, we can very clearly see the actual Futurama comic #1 from Bongo Comics, initially released back in the year 2000. Now, if you want to get even deeper with this reference, the copy seen here is actually the orange variant that was only available at San Diego Comic-Con. The regular version is red. Deep cut. I guess Zog went to Comic-Con. And now onto the final season, part 5. In chapter 41, Heads or Tails, we get a great deep cut reference. One of Dagmar's torture devices that she threatens Elfo with is actually a fleam, as seen in Futurama's episode T, the Terrestrial.
This
This is my flame. You use it to peel the skin off your enemies layer by layer till they die or whatever.
In Chapter 42, Fish Out of Water, we get a probably coincidental but fun illusion. Zog is forced to fight a giant robot in a wrestling ring. In Futurama's Raging Bender, a John DiMaggio-voiced Bender is also forced to fight against a massive killer robot. Okay, small Simpsons tangent, because these two episodes also feature some amazing Simpsons references. One being this steamed hams sign in Steamland, a reference to the classic episode 22 short films about Springfield.
I thought we were having steamed clams.
No, I said steamed hams.
This was from season 7, which was co-ran by Josh Weinstein, who also obviously runs Disenchantment. Then, in probably the deepest cut reference you could possibly imagine, during the credits for Squalid Squirrel, we see that specifically the arm animation was done by Hig Heisler, directly referencing the Simpsons episode Lady Bouvier's Lover from nearly 30 years ago.
This is a Snagglepuss drawn by Hig Heisler. It is worth something. This is an arm drawn by nobody. It is worth nothing.
That's a fun one. The episode Electric Ladyland also gives us a couple more nods. First, we see that the lesbian bar that Bean and Mora wander into for information is called Electric Ladyland, same as the title of the episode, obviously. In Futurama's episode The Lesser of Two Evils, Bender, Flexo, and Fry go to a robot strip club of the same name. These both, however, seem to be referencing the title of the Jimi Hendrix album. Later in the same episode, we get the third and final example of Zog and Bender's now shared catchphrase.
Let's go already!
The next is probably the best of the season. In Chapter 44, in the background at the Freak Show, we can see an exhibit called Toad Prints, and if you look closely, it is definitely the Hypno-Toad. And the final reference is in Chapter 45. As they rotate destinations on the submarine dial, one of them clearly lists Luna Park, the name of the amusement park on the moon in Futurama. And that's it. All of the Futurama references I noticed in all of Disenchantment. I know there are some others that people claim are references, but I think the similar animation styles just create parallels where otherwise there actually aren't any. I don't think that this kid is meant to be a reference to Fry. No, this guy in the pile of corpses is not Scruffy. You can see that his hair is different if you look closely. This airship from the very first episode of the show was never meant to be the Planet Express ship. It was actually just foreshadowing the existence of Steamland. And Satan's guitar is not the same as Silicon Red's guitar, though they are similar styles. There's just lots of stuff like this. So I think that I found every single reference the show has to offer, but I am willing to be proven wrong. If there was a reference you think I missed, please let me know in the comments. And we're back. Disenchantment has returned for part 4 on Netflix with 10 more episodes, and I'm here to break down how they made me feel and what I think we'll see moving forward. So last year, Disenchantment Part 3 invested me in the series like the first 2 parts did not. The show embraced serialization instead of falling back into episodic stretches. It set up engaging mysteries that I was ecstatic to dive into, and it showed us sides of the Disenchantment universe that we simply hadn't seen yet. And while Part 4 does continue a lot of the things I loved about Part 3, I'm sad to say that it also falls back into some of its previous tendencies that I did not love as much. I felt very thrown off in the first few episodes of the season because after Part 3 so seamlessly wove its story into the serialized format, the first 3 episodes of Part 4 all felt very separate from one another. Granted, I see what they were doing. Each episode, Love is Hell, The Good, the Bad, and the Bum Bum, and The Cabinet of Dr. Chaz, all followed up a separate cliffhanger from the end of Part 3. Love is Hell focuses on the Bean and Lucy cliffhangers, as Bean was about to be married off to a mysterious figure in hell, and Lucy had died and was actually sent to heaven for his sacrifice. The Good, the Bad, and the Bum Bum focuses on Elfo being kidnapped by the ogres and finally following up on the storyline about his mother. And The Cabinet of Dr. Chaz is all about Zog's return from insanity at the insane asylum. And while I don't dislike any of these things individually, I cannot pretend it didn't feel disjointed to jump from one to the next to the next. I guess the through line is Bean's return to Dreamland, but those scenes are so few and far between that I almost forgot about them. I wish they had found a way to weave all of these stories together to make the first 3 of the season feel a little more interconnected and serialized. Because like I said, I really liked the stories in these 3 episodes, but I was just thrown off by the way they were all so separate. But let's talk about them and their implications. So the big reveal was that Dagmar was trying to marry off Bean to Satan himself, which seems to tie into the contract that Maru made with Hell that's been drawn out for over 40 episodes. But at the last moment, Bean uses Dagmar's blood for the marriage contract instead of her own. First of all, the animation for the sequence was so cool. I really love how the blood handprints clasp each other. That's rad. But second, this whole development I think is really interesting, because while Dagmar has generally seemed to be on top of everything that is happening, this feels to me like something she did not expect to happen. She yells no when her blood is stamped on the contract, her facial expressions here look like genuine confusion, and even the way she speaks to Bean afterwards initially feels like genuine concern. Who knows, maybe I'm wrong here, this might all be a ruse, but I think this is an instance of Dagmar simply falling into success, since now she is seemingly the queen of hell. But of course we don't really get much more out of this development for the rest of the season, save for a bit on the back end, which I think is largely representative of another issue I have with the show. They tend to always set up these big cliffhangers, especially at the end of a season, and then breeze right past their resolution. We see this in the next 2 episodes as well. I was really happy that we finally got the full reveal of who Elfo's mother is, and that he's half ogre, and that backstory was all great. But then Elfo is literally just whisked away at the end of the episode by wild happenstance. They basically ignore the whole ogre story for the remainder of the season. Zog's time in the insane asylum felt similar. The whole Zog insanity arc in part 3 felt like such a huge deal, and then they basically solve it in a single episode. Granted, I do like the way they addressed the storyline somewhat, forcing Zog to confront that very fear that sent him down his mental health spiral in the first place, being buried alive. The way he faced this and came out of it unscathed mostly worked for me. And while I do think that many of these resolutions, largely Dagmar and Elfo being half ogre, will have larger implications in the grand scheme of the series, it's frustrating to feel like the show just breezes right past them. This happens more later in the season too, so we'll talk about it when we get there. Oh, and we didn't even mention Jerry, who comes back in a hugely satisfying way this season. He basically returns to life and becomes just super lovable. I'm really glad that he's becoming a larger part of the cast because he's a sweet and genuine boy.
Joey's back!
So next, let's talk about Cloyd, Becky, and Freckles. I'm gonna do an entire separate video about Freckles as well, but this whole storyline has a lot of questions to be answered. Cloyd and Becky start to rule Dreamland in everyone's absence and are experimenting, turning Dreamland citizens into goons. The crew manages to drive the duo out of the castle, but they stick around when Freckles re-enters the picture. Basically, as I predicted after part 3, thanks to this ancient language graffiti that read Freckles was here, it turns out Freckles was alive all along. Cercerio and Oddval believe they are responsible for bringing him to life, but we see him move on his own before the experiment. He was definitely sentient prior to this, and Freckles seems to have an existing relationship with Cloyd and Becky, who also both inhabit the bodies of other ventriloquist dummies. The big question I have here surrounding the story is, who the hell is inhabiting Freckles if that's how this works? And that's going to be the big question that my Freckles video focuses on, so stay tuned for that. But I think that Freckles' motivations so far do seem to line up with Cloyd, Becky, and Dagmar in a lot of ways. He spends his entire first appearance this season trying to splinter Bean and Zog's relationship.
Bean's so predictable. 1, she's gonna come over here. 2, she's gonna say, shut up, Freckles. 3, she's gonna say, you're crazy.
While also exploring the depths of Zog's dreams and going after his childhood insecurities in competition with his brother Yogg, as well as his position as king. And because Freckles seemed to be sold to Zog by Dagmar, or somebody who looks an awful lot like Dagmar back in part 3, I think it's likely that Freckles is attempting to weaken the leadership in Dreamland to make room for Dagmar. This lines up with his plan towards the end of the season 2, as Freckles basically orchestrates a situation where Derek and Jasper think they've killed an elf, and then are encouraged to flee Dreamland. By leaving a note behind for Zog, it ensures that he will go after his children, leaving Bean alone to lead the kingdom. After this initial little Freckles arc, we get an underwater episode where Bean, Elfo, Lucy, and Zog meet the Sea Trogs, who live in a fractured section of Dreamland Castle that rests under the sea. While the episode itself was just okay for me, I really liked getting this little bit of history about Dreamland Castle, and also seeing what parts of the castle looked like when they were still inhabited by the elves. And the entire existence of Sea Trogs begs some more questions based on a later reveal this season, but we'll get there. Okay, let's do it. Let's talk about Mora's return. Now, we all knew it was coming when Bean passed out underwater, but I have to admit I was still very unsettled by how long they sat on her lifeless body floating there. It was an uncomfortably long wait for Mora to smash through that window. But this was definitely a gratifying moment, and though it was but a tease, I think it works super effectively. The writers really called how much people would attach to Bean and Mora last season, and now they're slow building it in a way that I expect to pay off big in part 5.
I gotta go.
I also loved the heart-to-heart that Zog and Bede had about her romance with Mora, and the way they connected over their lost loves. These are the kinds of character moments where this season really excelled for me. This led Zog to seek out Ursula again, so hey, let's talk about Jasper. Another prediction confirmed. I really like how we saw Zog learning to be a better father for Jasper. It was sweet, and I've always loved his relationship with Ursula as well. Though let's be honest, literally none of us thought that Ursula was dead after this one. This show does kind of have a death problem. They've killed Elfo, Zog, Lucy, Bean, and Ursula now. None of them are actually dead. But I did love the development this led to, with Jasper living at the castle and forming a rivalry turned bond with his half-brother Derek. This was all really, really good stuff for me. The These final 4 episodes are really where the season kicks into high gear, which I guess is a pretty common pattern with the show now. In the 7th episode, we get this very ominous flashback that showcases a battle in this castle cove between humans and a team up of elves and mermaids. This is super interesting and I think probably deserves more delving into. In the sequence, we see the elves and mermaids are actually winning the battle until an unseen force appears and vaporizes them all with the same lightning power that Bean possesses. A dagger is then thrust into the mermaid's chest, killing her. On top of this, for some reason, Bean is shown this flashback when she grabs the hilt of the dagger herself, almost like the hilt of the dagger was triggering this memory. So there is obviously some major connection between the unseen elf/mermaid slayer and Bean herself. A distant relative maybe? Something even more sinister? I'm gonna mull this one over as I rewatch the entire series, but I'm really curious to hear your thoughts as well. So let's talk about all of the big revelations in the final 3 episodes of the season. One of the big ones is obviously that trogs and elves are the same, which called it, though I didn't call that it was the goo that turned elves into trogs. This also raises questions about sea trogs. Are they trogs who have evolved to live underwater, or are they actually some kind of other creature that has eaten the goo and turned into a trog variant? Also, does that matter? The goo is a huge source of questions moving forward. We saw they used it to resurrect Lucy's body earlier in the season, giving him wings. Then Bean drinks some in the final stretch of episodes, which leads to this whole Dream Bean duplicate story, which I have to admit seemed to come out of nowhere. But I do think there are a few smaller things we can deduce about this. I think the goo has got to have some unique effect on Bean, Lucy, and Elfo, as they are the trog saviors. The symbol on the goo bottles is literally the symbol of their triumvirate.
For only the one true savior can use the ultimate power of the goo to save us all.
Now, the timing is wonky, but we did see Lucy's body seemingly come back to life early in the season, while his soul was still navigating the afterlife. So 2 Lucys? And around the same time, we saw the trogs pour the goo into Lucy's body. Is it possible that the goo specifically has something to do with these dream variants popping up, especially when you take into account Lucy's rambling about his dream counterpart, which I just have to point out is named Goosey. C. They play this like a joke that overstays its welcome, but I mean, come on, a Lucy duplicate with the literal word goo in the name. This is Gooigi all over again. They nearly feed Elfo the goo earlier in the season as well, so I'm curious if something important will happen when all 3 saviors consume it. I actually also think this might explain Dagmar eating the trog brains back in part 3. If trogs are elves with goo running through them, is this Dagmar trying to consume the goo for herself? And honestly, I have no idea where this duplicate Bean storyline might go. Though it is interesting to point out that the dream duplicate Bean is the one who inhabits Bean's original body, the one that consumed the goo in the first place. And in the end, Bean beheads her old body, and Dagmar is left with Bean's original head. The post-credits tease shows Dagmar, Satan, and Bean's head on the 3 thrones of Dreamland. It would be pretty gross if we saw Dagmar eating her own daughter's brain, right? But what people are really going to talk about is that cliffhanger kiss between Bean and Mora, reunited for real, at last. It's interesting. Part 4 actually seems to leave fewer blatant cliffhangers than Part 3, though there are still a few. Dagmar is now in control of Dreamland, that's one. Zog needs to rescue Derek, Jasper, Ursula, Oddval, and probably Freckles from the Steamland Freak Show, and Bean is now with Mora, which I guess is less of a cliffhanger and more of just where she was when the season ended. So based off the general trajectory of the past cliffhangers, my guess is that these get wrapped up pretty quickly into Part 5, but hopefully it also means we get another episode with Bean and Mora hanging out in the Mermaid Society. But I do think that this might be an interesting angle for the series moving forward. We see in that flashback that somebody who is somehow related to Bean's magic straight up murders this red-haired mermaid. A red-haired mermaid who was also seen on the stained glass in the ruins of the old Dreamland Castle underwater. And I don't think that's a coincidence, especially because Mora busts through that glass. But it also means the elves were immortalizing this red-haired mermaid, and likely before she died, since the events of that flashback, if I were to guess, are depicting the humans taking over Dreamland Castle for the first time. This might mean that this mermaid is an important figurehead in mermaid and elven history, and if they discover that Bean is somehow related to the person that murdered this figure, that could definitely cause drama for the Mora and Bean relationship. But I also think that if Bean and Mora are related to these two historical figures that were at the forefront of this Dreamland conflict, thematically it would make a ton of sense for them to get together, uniting their people and healing that rift. That seems to be a major theme in Disenchantment: unity. We saw the Trogs and Elves reunite this season, Elfo has this connection between the Elves and Ogres, Lucy has a connection between Heaven and Hell, and I'm still very confident in my Miri the Mop Girl theory, more than ever after part 4. If you haven't seen the video I did last year about that theory, please check it out, but the gist is that I think Miri is likely both related to an elf and the historical line of Oggs. I initially said I think it was a distant relation, but I'm now thinking that it might be more likely that she is just the daughter of an elf and King Yogg. This theoretically would have placed her ahead of Zog in the line of succession if they had known about her. This idea sprung from some very interesting imagery in part 3. For one, we briefly saw her ominously sitting on the throne in an episode, and later she has tossed the throne of Dreamland from Bean almost like a bouquet, and literally stood with it next to a line of busts of the previous kings, like she was next in line. Miri is also said to be 23 years old, but very short, and we curiously never actually see her ears. She hinted that she had some type of magic at the end of part 3 as well. Part 4 continued these little hints in a big way. For one, we got another shot of her sitting on the throne. They seem to be making a habit out of that. In another scene, Zog refers to her very curiously.
I'm room girl now.
Ooh, pardon me, Your Majesty.
They're kind of laying it on thick, to be honest. But the best evidence comes from her increased presence in the season in general. She's almost becoming one of the gang. And on top of that, one of the primary things she was doing this season was lecturing Bean on how to be a better leader.
Are you kidding me? You're the queen of Dreamland. You control everything. Maybe you should look beyond yourself and stop acting like a spoiled, entitled brat.
They were literally showing that Miri has the type of leadership skills and know-how to run a kingdom in a way that Bean does not. At this point, I would be completely shocked if this theory didn't turn out to be true, and honestly, I'm pretty proud of myself for it. So overall, I liked part 4, but felt a little let down after how much I loved part 3. It felt like a bit of a step back structurally, and I do find myself growing a bit tired of how many mysteries the show continues to set up, and then how brazenly these mysteries are answered. I wish we would just live with the ramifications of these mysteries for a bit when they're solved. That being said, I can still see all the pieces, and I do have faith that everything is going to come together in a really interesting way. I think we should probably expect a renewal announcement soon. I know some artists have been working on Disenchantment as recently as January, which tells me they're probably working on new episodes. I would expect one more production season for a total of 60 episodes, and that the next 20 will likely be written to the series finale. I'd also love to hear what you thought of Disenchantment Part 4, so please let me know below in the comments. Peace. Well, that's all, folks. Disenchantment has completed after 5 seasons and a grand total of 50 episodes. While I was initially on the fence about this show, over time I really grew to love and appreciate its characters, lore, world building, and storytelling. And now I can honestly say I am incredibly sad that it's over. I've watched through the show so many times that it's become a true comfort series. Though it has its flaws, it's genuinely become one of my favorite animated series in recent memory, and fortunately, in my opinion, it delivered an incredibly satisfying and heartfelt conclusion with these final 10 episodes. I've got a lot to gush about, so let's do this one last time and talk about Disenchantment Part 5. And this, of course, will be filled with spoilers for the entire series, so this is your final spoiler warning. Alright, let's do it. So I've said before that the season that really got me invested in Disenchantment was Part 3, which I felt found a perfect pacing with its serialized storytelling and mystery setups. Then with Part 4, I felt a little bit let down as the show fell back a little bit into its former episodic tendencies. I'm really pleased to say that I felt Part 5 once again absolutely nailed its story-focused pacing. Though it also feels like they maybe had no other choice. The rumor had always been that Disenchantment had planned to be 60 episodes long. The show had been picked up in 20 episode orders for parts 1 through 4, but sadly, for this latest pickup, they only opted for 10 final episodes. It seems like the writers were tasked with wrapping up potentially 20 episodes worth of story in the final 10. However, I think that they accomplished this admirably. This season built off of the cliffhanger from part 4 and very effectively escalated just about every aspect of the ongoing story to its climactic conclusion. That isn't to say that I wouldn't have preferred an additional 10 episodes, because there are aspects of these final 10 that felt a bit rushed and I wish had a little more room to breathe. In particular, the biggest reason I wish we had gotten a part 6 was so that we could have spent a bit more time with Bean and Mora being in a relationship. I liked how part 3 and 4 teased the Bean-Mora connection. There was a lot of exciting anticipation waiting for that subplot to flourish, so it was awesome to see it play out here. It just feels like the end of season twists and turns could have hit a tad harder had we gotten to see them spend a bit more time together. But everything still hit really well for me, so it's really just wishful thinking. I truly just want more of this show, if I'm being honest. I've also seen reactions from fans lean a bit negative to this final season, which really confuses me. I do think finales generally will bring out more vocal disappointment. That's just kind of the nature of things ending. But after watching part 5 and then rewatching the entire series, including part 5 again, I can't express enough how satisfied I was with this conclusion. While they didn't explicitly spell out every single mystery for the audience, I think the vast majority of them are right there for us to see. But most importantly, the show absolutely did right by its characters, delivering so many beautiful and heartfelt full arc moments for just about everybody. But obviously, I'll go over not only the mysteries that the show closes up here, but why I felt the conclusion was so well handled. So the first episode, Heads or Tails, obviously immediately follows up the big Bean vs. Bad Bean ending of part 4. If you recall, Bean cut off her evil doppelganger's head, and then Dagmar threw Bean into the ocean where she was saved by Mora. Part 5 opens with Dagmar taking control of Dreamland and interrogating the remaining gang, who's all trying to keep Bad Bean's body from Dagmar so she can't use it for her evil plan. This leads to some really fun interrogation sequences and a bunch of sneaking around the castle through secret passages. I love that kind of stuff. Plus, I'm pretty sure Merkimer was gone for all of part 4, so it was great to see him return. Put Matt Berry in everything, please. I really enjoyed the little subplot we got with Lucy and Satan as well, seeing Lucy sort of geek out about Satan as though he's a rock star. That made for a fun dynamic. Though I'm not entirely sold on the reveal that Lucy is Satan's son. There are some moments where it plays well later in the season, but I wish it had been forecasted a little bit more. It just kind of felt like it was out of nowhere. My biggest laugh in this episode is for sure Vip and Vap tripping Dagmar and then immediately just ripping a bong afterwards. So funny. So while all of this is going down, Bean has a little romantic getaway with Mora, and with the gang in danger and Bean living her best life, this all kind of sets up Bean's final season dilemma really well.
I feel better right now than I've felt since probably ever. I don't want to go back home.
For so much of the series, Bean has had to figure out how to balance duty with desire. That's what the very first episode is about. She's supposed to be married off so that Dreamland can form an alliance with Bentwood, but she puts herself first, as she should have in that situation. But now, by part 5, Bean's obligations have become so much more than just a strategic diplomatic marriage. Not only is she now the actual queen of Dreamland, but she's also formed so many meaningful friendships and connections. When the show started, she was kind of a loner, and she was being forced into a life she didn't want for herself. Now, she has all of these different people who depend on her. So as much as Mora's pleas for Bean to run away with her are enticing, Bean knows that she can't do that.
I want to. I really, really do. But my friends are up there and I'm their queen.
Bean's destiny means the weight of all of Dreamland is on her shoulders, and suddenly, for the first time in her life, she's also given an opportunity to live the life she's always dreamed of.
What do you want? No one's ever asked me that before.
And this is a major focus this entire season. Bean coming to the realization that her destiny might have grave consequences for herself or for those she loves, and trying to move forward with that duty regardless. And with everyone thinking that Bean died at the end of part 4, we get one of my favorite moments in the entire series as Elfo laments the loss of his friend. He laments, as he says, not the loss of the past, but the loss of the future that they'll never get.
I wasted so much time wanting you to be something else for me. I didn't appreciate what you were. My friend. My best friend.
I can't express how much I dig this growth and realization from Elfo. As someone who is immediately exhausted by Elfo's obsession with Bean in the early seasons, to see them turn that into such a touching moment of self-actualization was really, really satisfying. In general, they do a great job wrapping up character arcs like this season. And it hits even harder with Bean climbing through the window, having heard everything that Elfo just said. What a great, great moment. While part 4 started with a few disparate episodes that focused on different characters, part 5 falls back into a more serialized pace, and these first few have basically 3 focused storylines going on simultaneously. You've got a ton of Bean and Mora relationship focus, you've got the gang trying to make sure Dagmar doesn't unite Bad Bean's head and body, and in Steamland you've got Zog trying to find his other kids, who were kidnapped at the end of last season. And all of these plots interweave and overlap at various points. Bean having to carry Mora around Dreamland because she's a mermaid, obviously, is a pretty funny sitcom-y storyline, but it also creates for some fun fun drama in these early stages of their relationship. Also, very funny physical comedy, alongside the other members of the gang trying to get Bad Bean's body to lumber around the right way. There's some really fun animation throughout. An obvious highlight of the episode is Mora and Bean in the confessional booth, clearing the air about what happened after their first rendezvous. They do a great job this entire season with these cute Bean x Mora moments. Comedically, I also really enjoyed these parts of Zog's storyline in Steamland. They do that thing where a character just straight up describes all of the plot points of the show as we've experienced them, and everyone just kind of laughs at how absurd they sound lined up one after the other.
Let me out of here! I gotta rescue my kids and get back with my magic daughter to fight my ex-wife, the witch!
And the end of the second episode once again has another beautiful character building moment, this time for Zog. While fleeing an angry mob, Zog starts reflecting on his past and his mistakes, and through the secret camera in his crown, Bean sees everything.
The only good thing I ever did is get out of Bean's way and let her be the awesome woman she is today.
I said it before, but this season really nails these moments of self-actualization for so many characters, bringing them full circle. There's a lot I love about this next little leg of the season, starting in the third episode, Electric Ladyland, with one last adventure to Steamland. Though I do have to say that I think the traveling sequence to Steamland was a little too reminiscent of how it went down in part 3. Bean and a companion on a motorcycle, they get to the mountains, lose the motorcycle, and need a new means of transport to get there. Kind of repeaty. But at least we get some more Una in here because this moment is perfect.
This is Mora. Is girlfriend? Or is...
While it felt mostly out of necessity because of the final season rush, these episodes do a lot of good work to show Bean and Mora's relationship hit a lot of different milestones and snags. Though I do think it was a bit drawn out, the argument they have about whether or not Mora is a whole woman served its purpose in at least showing that they're going through conflict in their relationship. It isn't all honeymoon phase excitement. But again, I can't help but feel like this all would have worked better over an additional 10 episodes, sprinkling in Bean and Mora stories across 20 episodes instead of front-loading this season because we're racing towards the finish line. Honestly, I just personally love anything in Steamland. I would have watched an entire series set in this place. Truly some of my favorite backgrounds in animation history. It's just such a vibrant and beautiful location. Their search for Zog eventually leads them to a confrontation with Alva, who brings them up to his skyscraper and reveals that he's been taking care of Zog. I kind of love the way this show sprinkles tiny hints for things that really only pay off if you're paying super close attention. If you look closely, when Zog arrives at the robot fight in the previous episode, you can see Alva and the Archdruidess in the crowd. We also know that they have access to the camera in his crown, so it makes sense that they'd be able to track his location. And this episode is where we actually start to get a lot more insight into actually what Alva's goals are. I think some people were disappointed that there wasn't more of a focus on his plan and that it didn't play into the conclusion as much, but ultimately his aims are pretty clear the entire show. Alva is interested in using magic to further scientific exploration. This is why he has a contract with Satan to use the steam from hell to actually power Steamland and allow their innovation to flourish. This is also why he wants Bean. Her electric abilities are basically an unlimited power source. He wants to harness that magic for science. He basically says this outright back in part 3.
What exactly are you offering here?
An alliance is what I'm offering between magic and science.
Hence why we see this bean-sized suit in this episode, meant to harness her electricity to power something. And this is obviously also why he's interested in the goo, but we'll also get to that later when we reach the finale. It also becomes clearer that part of his attraction to Bean is because she looks like a squirrel with those big teeth, and he has an absolutely unhealthy obsession with the squalid squirrel cartoons. That is honestly a pretty funny reveal in my book. Speaking of infatuation reveals, it becomes clear that the Archdruidess is mostly working with Alva because she has a huge crush on him, which tracks. Why else would she have a portrait of the guy in her church in Dreamland? I understand it might not be everyone's cup of tea, but I truly appreciate how much more you get out of this show when you really focus on all of the little details. They don't spell everything out for you, and to me, that makes it more fun to consume. Piecing everything together is part of the fun for me. In the following episode, the gang finally rescues Derek, Bearboy, and Freckles from the freak show at the Steamland Carnival, which leads to Zog and Ursula reuniting. I know this was revealed at the end of last season, and I'm not going to complain because I want Zog and Ursula to live a happy life together, but this show definitely has a problem with fake-out deaths. It genuinely might be its favorite thing to do. Sometimes characters fully die and then come back from heaven and hell. Barely any characters in the entire show who are thought to have died actually remain dead. Okay, but during this jailbreak, we get what is probably my favorite animated sequence in anything in so long, I really couldn't even tell you how long. Bean and Zog go into a Dreamland-themed dark ride at the fair, and holy crap, this is just one of the most creative, mind-blowing, most gorgeously animated sequences I have ever seen. Not only is it just so cool looking, it captures the vibe of a classic dark ride so perfectly. I particularly love the detail that you can even see the henchbots moving behind the scenes to help operate the ride. I mean, this might just be a good time to gush about Disenchantment's animation in general. I don't think there is a single American animated TV series that I like more on an animation level. This series has some of the most stunning backgrounds I've ever seen, and absolutely everything is directed so dynamically. So many establishing shots have really creative camera moves or rack focuses, foreground and background elements. This show does a great job blending its 3D elements with its 2D elements as well. I cannot say enough about how amazing of a job the animation team did on this series. It's the best looking Matt Groening show by a wide margin, and that actually is why it's really disappointing to see that the animation studio, Rough Draft, has a tendency not to credit its artists properly. I'll post a link in the description, but there's a great Twitter thread by one of the background designers about their crediting policies, which are frankly very frustrating. Please show all of the artists all the support you can. Anyways, let's get back to the story. The final Steamland adventure ends with Bean and Zog being separated from the other rescued gang, which leads to really one of our only substantial Freckles scenes in this entire season. There is a ton I love about how this final season played out, but I think it's clear that Freckles was a mystery that could have really benefited from an additional season. And I'm not just saying that because I had all of these theories about who he actually is. Basically, in this sequence, Freckles reveals his only real goal.
It's that we all just want to be real boys.
And I like the angle here, that Freckles didn't even get attention as a toy and sat motionless in the window for years. I mean, we literally see him in the window in the first episode of the entire show. He basically just wants attention, to be loved. He has a heart, he has a soul, etc. And I think these ideas could have been really great to explore more. Unfortunately, by the end of the season, this is about the extent of how it's explored. There's a ton of potential with this character in regards to what it actually means to be human. I mean, we could have had Freckles realizing that he doesn't need validation from outside sources to be able to live a fulfilling life. But I also understand why this is a thread that sort of fell by the wayside, given the number of things they had to wrap up this season. I think they probably chose wisely. While these Steamland adventures are all going down, the gang back at Dreamland continue to try and keep Dagmar from uniting Bad Bean's head and body. This whole story does play out over a few episodes, but it's such a small focus in the first couple until the Trogs fill Bad Bean with goo, which leads into a really fun horror movie-like storyline with this headless corpse lumbering towards Elfo the entire episode. There are some crazy creepy shots of the body crawling and sliding through passages. I loved the way these sequences were animated. This leads into a really great episode that brings things all the way back to season 1, and I actually loved something that Dagmar points out here.
None of this would have been possible without you. You were murdered so I could live.
So much of this story really does come down to Elfo's first decision in the entire show, to leave Elfwood. Elfo stumbling into Dreamland leads to the entire search for the Eternity Pendant, which leads to his death and Bean's decision to save Dagmar. It's the major inciting incident for all of this conflict, but also the inciting incident for what would basically reunite and fix many aspects of this world. But again, we'll get there. This leads Elfo down an existential path, and he ends up using the orb we've seen previously to time travel back to when he was killed. Side note, the animation in the time travel sequence, so great. Now, I always thought who killed Elfo was sort of irrelevant. The important thing was that it happened, not necessarily who did it. But I gotta say, the reveal that Elfo actually killed himself on accident is perfect. Such a funny twist, and so very Elfo. Even if they fudged the orb's abilities a tiny bit to make it work, it was absolutely worth it. And the other Elfo development I like this season is his relationship with Mop Girl. This obviously didn't seem to be hinted at any time before this season. However, I think the way it escalates is really well handled, starting with them making out just as a ruse to hide Bad Bean's body. But the way their connection escalates over the course of the season feels really natural to me. Mop Girl sort of helps anchor Elfo into the reality of the situations they face, specifically calling him out for trying to dangerously change the past. Elfo is hugely encouraging to Mop Girl, pointing out her natural talents and ability to lead. They're a good fit, and there are more reasons I think the pairing makes sense thematically that I'll go over towards the end of the season. And this was a really nice touch. Anyone remember this line from season 1?
What do you want? I guess I've always wanted to watch the sunrise with a girl I fancy.
And the very beginning of the episode where Elfo and Miri actually start getting together? They watch the sunrise together. Love it. Okay, I guess now is a good time to address it. The Miri reveal. We finally see confirmation that Miri the Mop Girl has elf ears. She is half elf, half human, and obviously this comes at the end of the season, but she becomes Dreamland's new queen. And yes, I totally called this 2.5 years ago. Huge thanks to everyone who flocked to that video to post excited comments about me being right. It was really gratifying. I even got an incredibly nice tweet from showrunner Josh Weinstein about the video. It was really cool to experience. Obviously, some aspects of my theory were not precise. We do not learn exactly who Miri's parents are, so my prediction that she was the daughter of Yogg was not confirmed. But we also don't get confirmation that it wasn't Yogg, just that Miri was left in the Enchanted Forest as a baby. Ditching the bastard half-elf child of a king isn't too crazy of a scenario for this world. Even without the familial reveal, the important aspect of that theory was why she would be the right ruler for Dreamland, and they say it outright here.
Let's say you are half human, half elf. Think of the possibilities. I'm not just talking about us, I'm talking about uniting Dreamland.
So yeah, I'm pretty proud of that one. The next 2 episodes are the only 2 this season that even feel a little bit episodic, but even then they take place in the midst of a big traveling adventure, and that's sort of how I most appreciated the episodic stories throughout this show, the ones that were their own individual story but were baked into a larger serialized event happening around them. Arguably the best episode in the entire show is Last Splash, which is very much its own episodic story set while they're on a boat traveling home from Steamland. The first of these is the Science of Homemade Lightning, which has some really fun stuff going for it. It's basically Bean's training montage, her Dagobah, learning how to harness and focus her lightning from the Queen of the Crones. I think my favorite part of this episode, though, is the sequence where Cloyd and Becky are hanging Zog above the hole to hell as Asmodeus is rising up through it. Bean's lightning closes the hatch just in time to decapitate Asmodeus. Just a really cool event conceptually and in execution. And Bean then destroys the Eternal Flame that we've seen since season 1, which in turn destroys this entire temple. And because of this, Maru starts to flourish, becoming this lush, beautiful place. I particularly love this development. Bean was said to be the one who was supposed to fulfill this mysterious prophecy for the good of Maru, and in the end, ousting her evil family from Maru was actually what saved the land and its people. And as Bean reaches her full potential, we conversely see Bad Bean's head and body finally reunite, paving the way for the final showdown. The next episode lands Bean and Zog back in the Twinkletown Asylum, which is a bit of a detour, but it leads to some really great existential development from Bean as she really starts to reconcile with the battle that lies ahead of her, and the idea that by stopping Dagmar, she may have to sacrifice her own existence, which also hits Zog in a heavy way too.
You shouldn't have to choose between existing and saving Dreamland. Baby girl, you gotta save yourself.
Which hits even harder knowing how Zog treated Bean early on in the series, using her as a diplomatic pawn who would have to sacrifice her own life and goals for the furthering of Dreamland's interests. We also see Mop Girl and Elfo start to unite all of the people surrounding Dreamland in preparations for the final battle throughout the previous 2 episodes, which is a development I love. The elves, trogs, humans, and creatures of the Enchanted Forest, even the mole people, everyone starts doing the work to take down Dagmar, uniting everybody against a common cause for a better world. Probably the most important theme in the show, in my opinion. And this leads us into basically the epic 3-part finale, starting with the Battle of Falling Water. Actually, this might be a good time to tell everyone, if you didn't know, that there are actually Disenchantment comics coming out soon. Apparently, over the course of the show, they created around 500 pages of comics and strips set in Dreamland. I've read a couple of them from this Comic-Con exclusive book that I'm fortunate enough to have a copy of, but they want to release 3 volumes of tons more comic book content, starting with Untold Tales Volume 1 in November. If you like this show, I want to urge all of you to please buy this because I really want them to release all 3 volumes. This has always felt like a world that could be expanded on in so many ways, and comics are kind of perfect for that. And the couple I've read are really fun, so I hope these are just as good. Alright, I think we gotta talk about the best moment in the entire series. Vip and Vap swinging hammers. Some people are so upset about this, and to them I say, have you no soul? This is so funny. In my opinion, these final 3 episodes deliver some truly incredible escalations and an honestly very violent battle, but most importantly, great character closure. Despite Bean trying to stop Dagmar herself to protect her friends, everyone shows up to help. Not just all of the various species that live in Dreamland, but the pirates and the mermaids, and it was cool to see Bean and Mora fight side by side. But there are 2 majorly important things that happen here. Bean takes on Bad Bean in the Crystal Caverns and uses these crystals to charge her magic abilities. We learn that these caverns
caverns are where Dreamland's true magic can be unlocked. It's why Dagmar took Bean there when she was younger. And I love the reveal from God himself that the magic in Dreamland is actually a natural phenomenon. Basically, the angels' tears fall from heaven into the Dreamland River. They seep down under the castle, and the steam from hell rises up and combines with those waters, creating the Crystal Caverns. I really like this show's sort of reconciliation of science and fantasy. It's reminiscent of how they would reconcile faith and science in Futurama.
And it all originally comes from nature. And you know what? When you understand it, science is magic.
And this specific reveal that it's a natural phenomenon was actually hinted at back in part 3 as well.
You call it magic, but really it's simply natural phenomena we don't yet understand.
This is also the second Battle of Falling Water. It's sort of a history repeating itself situation, but it also appears as though the first battle was basically fought for the same thing, access to the Crystal Caverns to unlock Dreamland's magic. And the key to unlocking that magic is Bean's electric abilities. This is why we see in the flashback to the first battle that there is another being with electric abilities, likely there to also utilize the caverns. And Bean using her magic through the crystals here is exactly what unlocks Dreamland's magic, and in the following episode we actually see that magic start to seep through Dreamland, affecting its residents. But before we start to see the ramifications of this, we get probably the most shocking event in the entire series. Bad Bean uses illusionary magic, and when Bean thinks she's stabbing her evil doppelganger, it's revealed that she actually stabs Mora, killing her. This was foreshadowed in 2 ways. Mora told Bean about the first Battle of Falling Water and the story of the mermaid who was killed there, becoming a constellation to illuminate the way to Mermaid Island. Bean is also given a vision when she grabbed the knife that killed that very mermaid, showing the final moments of the first battle and imagining herself stabbing the mermaid, devastating foreshadowing. But the reveal that Bean killed her true love is heartbreaking, and she understandably goes full fury mode, decimating Bad Bean with her lightning. Now, I know this is the show that absolutely refuses to kill off characters, so a lot of people didn't necessarily expect Mora to stay dead, but personally, I don't think it matters in context, because what's important is Bean's grief and growth through this grief. At first, she lets her grief consume her. She completely gives up, and without her help, Elfo, Miri, and Lucy do not stand a chance against Dagmar, and Lucy is actually killed again. But for real this time, his body, except for his tail, is incinerated in lava, and Lucy's death is Bean's big wake-up call.
Lucy's dead, Bean.
What? No way!
In lamenting the love that she's lost, she's now lost another of the most important people in her life. This big fight with Dagmar has what, to me, is one of the greatest pieces of writing in the entire show. One of the major messages this series has to offer, that love isn't just something we experience and have, it's something that stays with us through our memories. Bean's love for Mora isn't gone just because Mora is. And this isn't just a great message, it's beautifully foreshadowed. Let's jump back to Last Splash and listen back to Mora's song.
And someday if there's a war on some not so distant shore and lines are drawn, I'm never gone.
Mora explicitly spelled out in that first major appearance exactly what Bean would need to remember. Even after her death, she's never gone.
This star's your guide, and I am always on your side.
And what happens in this battle with Dagmar? Just when Bean looks to be bested, the star pendant falls out of her collar, and that star is her guide to remember that Mora is always with her, that Mora is always on her side.
See, Mom? That's the power of love. It's not just the moment love happens. Love's the memories long after it's gone.
And this ultimately continues to power Bean through to the end. I just really love the attention to these little character details. Everything is set up beautifully if you look close enough. All right, before we dive into the actual final episode, let's talk about Jerry. I cannot get over how his story escalated. Jerry has always been probably the sweetest character in the show, but having died twice now, he is also always at odds with God, which is so funny to me. He's just constantly questioning why God would allow all of these horrible things to happen, and God continues to give him unsatisfactory answers. And how does that play out here? Jerry kills God. He freaking bricks him. There's a whole sequence where Lucy and Jerry are trying to hide God's dead body. How can you not love that?
What is that? Is that who I think it is? What the hell did you do to his hand?
And the way the world becomes completely desaturated when God is bricked is so cool and creative. I almost wish we had gotten to see this play out for longer. Feels like a godless Dreamland could have been a really wild thing to explore for at least a few episodes, maybe a season cliffhanger. Let's dive into that finale now because there are a lot of things to talk about. The first being, this episode was written by Matt Groening solo? I am a little suspicious about this. Groening has co-written a handful of scripts for all 3 of his series, but his only other solo writing credit for any of his shows is the Simpsons episode Colonel Homer, which aired in 1992, over 20 years ago. I feel like the script was also probably handled by showrunner Josh Weinstein, who wrote the previous 2 episodes as well, but who knows, maybe it was all Groening, and this is a good finale. We do end up getting a full explanation for what the goo itself is, and it's once again a result of Dreamland's magic between heaven and hell. Basically, the Trogs consume the magic waters from the stalactites formed from their combination, and then the goo is actually their blended up brains. Pretty gross, but with Dagmar having been eating their brains, this actually does make sense. This likely helps fuel her own abilities because of their magical properties. Presumably, the brains have magical properties because they feed on the magic waters, and then continuing to feed on that magic keeps the Trogs alive without their brains, which is how they now protect themselves from both Dagmar's meals and from her entering their dreams. Okay, let's dive into the final battle itself. Personally, I love that they opted for this season's wild drug trip to take place during the final battle with Dagmar. And not only is this wildly impressive visually, like all of their drug trip sequences, but the way this is actually a compelling and well choreographed fight sequence during the trippy visuals makes it so impressive. And I loved that Una, the absolute badass that she is, had this huge moment in the end to come in and help Bean. Una being the mother that Bean deserved all along, fighting the mother who abused and used her, aiding her daughter when she needed it most. Okay, let's talk Alva, because it seems like people were a little confused about his plan and motivations. Yeah, maybe the end of his story could have been a little bit more involved in the actual climax of the season, but Alva was largely off doing his own thing the entire series, and I think his fate was fitting. Alva's ultimate plan basically lined up exactly with everything we'd seen from him. His attempts to utilize magic for massive scientific breakthrough. Alva wanted to use the Trog's goo as a power source to fly his rocket, and he needed Bean's electricity to be an unlimited power source so that the rocket could make the full journey. But where was he going? Well, he said the moon, but it's clear to me that that wasn't his actual goal. They made it to the moon. He had further sights in mind. I'm sure many of you caught it, but in the same shot of the rocket blasting from its home planet, we then see another planet appear beyond the moon, a planet that looks suspiciously like Earth. This is where Alva was going. He was trying to use magic to make this ultimate expedition. He needed the goo to lift the rocket into space and Bean's magic to power it the entire way there.
We need Bean's magic to survive the voyage.
Instead, the Trogs used Alva to get themselves to the moon, which is also perfectly fitting, given how absolutely obsessed with the moon they are. A great end to both of their stories, if you ask me. Though obviously this traveling to Earth thing seems to raise a lot of questions about the planet that Disenchantment takes place on, and also throws a ton of wrenches into the whole Futurama Disenchantment shared universe theory that everyone was convinced was fully confirmed after Futurama's latest Disenchantment cameo. Go check out my video about that one if you're interested. I would love to hear theories about these twin planets though, as they relate to Disenchantment. Okay, now let's talk about Lucy and how damn perfectly his arc comes to a conclusion. I have seen a shocking number of people upset that Lucy ends up in heaven, and I'm a little bit baffled by this. Lucy's entire thing throughout this entire series has been that while he is a personal demon, he's actually a genuine sweetheart deep down. He tries to act like he doesn't care, but literally throughout, he is constantly helping people at his own peril. I mean, they say this.
I'm gonna let you in on my darkest secret. I'm nice.
He literally gives up his immortality to save Bean and Elfo back in part 2. He loves to maintain the facade of being evil, but he is absolutely the sweetest boy. So, of course, his final act in the show is to forego his own happiness for the sake of one of his best friends.
Because what?
Because I love Bean.
But what makes it such a perfect full arc moment is that now it's not a secret that he's actually nice. He has embraced his true good self and he can no longer hide it, especially with these new angel wings in Halo. And how can you not love this hug between Lucy and Jerry? And of course, Lucy wishes Mora back to life. And while I have seen people upset that Mora doesn't stay dead, like so many others in the show, I think it's far more fitting for the series' happy ending, because ultimately Bean accepts that Mora is gone and is willing to move on carrying the love that they had. This isn't an example of Bean's growth being stifled by a Deus Ex Machina. It does two things beautifully. It represents the conclusion of Lucy's arc, and it gives us the happy ending between Bean and Mora after Bean's growth has been achieved. It's great. The end of the episode is just filled with some really beautiful final moments for basically every character you can think of, and I can't think of a better way for this fairy tale to end. I think the one I loved most in particular was Zog and Ursula. Zog was this character whose issues stemmed from the weight of expectations from his father, that he wasn't fit to be a leader, and here he has willingly given it up in place of love, and he tosses that crown away for good. Oddval and Sorcerio get married, Derek and Una keep pirating, Bunty and her family live in Bean's room now, even the freak show guy gets eaten. They really make the rounds, and I don't know how you couldn't end up smiling after this sequence. I have seen some people upset that we didn't really get any real explicit final moments between Bean, Elfo, or Lucy. This is one of the reasons people are upset that Lucy is still dead. But I'm gonna be honest with y'all, that's one of the major themes of the show, that the love people share doesn't just exist in the time that they're together, but it's carried with them throughout their lives. And the most important final moments for these characters was actually Bean describing exactly how much these friendships have affected and changed her.
You said we have to make our own destiny. And I rejected thinking that for a long time, but now that it doesn't matter anymore, I can finally embrace it.
This is the kind of final moment that aligns with that theme perfectly, that Bean is forever changed because of her connection to her two best friends.
My darling demon Lucy, you ruined my life. And somehow I'm a better person for it.
And the show ends with Bean bailing on her own wedding, exactly the way the series began. Beautifully full circle. And I know that people are upset that Elfo didn't get a moment with her, but he did get a goodbye.
Goodbye, Bean.
This is such a great moment that fully aligns with these themes. Speaking of themes, I've also seen some people argue that the whole Bean, Lucy, Elfo prophesied trio didn't amount to anything, and I could not disagree more. Another major thing this show focuses on is unity. It starts with this deeply broken world where there are all of these major conflicts between different kingdoms and species, and Bean, Elfo, and Lucy all represent the healing of these worldly wounds. Not only did Bean defeat the biggest threat to the world's peace in Dagmar, but she returned Dreamland to the elves and healed the rift between humans and mermaids with her relationship to Mora. Miri and Elfo are now in charge of Dreamland, a half-human half-elf and a half-ogre half-elf, further representing how the disparate societies of this world are coming together. And maybe biggest of all, Lucy is a demon who literally resurrected God. The reconciliation of heaven and hell is major, and for the first time ever, we have a demon who is also an angel. This trio healed the biggest rifts this world had to offer, and they left it a more unified place. Like I said, I have really grown to love and appreciate this show, and while I know this one could have benefited from another 10 episodes, with a couple aspects feeling a bit rushed towards the end, it's hard not to express how great of a job they did with these final episodes. I know some people just wanted some of these mysteries spelled out for them, but a good show always focuses on the characters, and that's what this one did. They did right by just about every single character and relationship. And if you're willing to look, those mysteries mostly all have answers, and the ones that don't make for great speculation and debate so that the show can live on beyond its years. It's funny, I actually found myself really relating to Elfo in the first episode of the season when he was talking about his relationship with Bean, except I was thinking about my relationship to this show.
I wasted so much time wanting you to be something else for me. I didn't appreciate what you were.
It's funny, I really did spend so long wanting this show to be something that it wasn't. But the more and more I've watched it, the more I've grown to appreciate what it is. That isn't to say it doesn't have its flaws, but it really does have so much to offer, and now that it's over, I'm really, really gonna miss it. So, I guess we should just say it one last time.
Goodbye, Bean.